So please give a huge round of applause as we talk about disinformation following the pandemic with the BBC Health and Disinformation reporter, Rachel Schraer. Huge round of applause.
Thank you. Hello, this is exciting. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm actually quite used to being among skeptics. You should see my Twitter mentions. There's a lot of questions asked there. Why are you a big pharma shill? Just to name one. So as Paul kindly introduced me, my name is Rachel Schraer, and I'm the BBC's Health and Disinformation reporter. It's been an interesting couple of years for both health and disinformation, I think it's probably fair to say. I actually spent quite a lot of the pandemic as a news reporter in the BBC's health team, just simply trying to report what was happening, communicate the evolving science, and give people the best possible information. This kind of straightforward news reporting tends to come from a standpoint that people are just seeking information in a kind of neutral way. They want to know what's going on, we can just tell them what's going on, and they'll feel really informed and they'll be really happy. Great. That is at least somewhat true for a lot of people. That kind of sort of just straightforward, neutral, fact-based reporting, which I guess the BBC is so famous for, it's what the BBC is all about, and it is hugely valuable. And so a reaction that I quite often get when I talk to people about my job is, like, isn't all journalism telling people facts? Why does it need its own separate department for fact-checking and misinformation? To which I say, look, Mum, it is a real job. It is a real job. Really, I think this view comes from a world without algorithmic recommendations, without coordinated disinformation campaigns and influencers. But back in the real world, there's actually pretty good evidence that if you want to stop people from being misinformed, not just inform them, but actually stop them being misinformed, alert them to the fact that bad information is circulating, and to try and inoculate them from that, it's really helpful to point out that a particular misleading claim is circulating, as well as just giving the correct information. So that's where fact-checking comes in. There's been a rise in dedicated fact-checking services across the world over the past few years, and that's partly been driven by a kind of like general sense in society that truth has been coming under threat. I worked for the BBC's fact-checking service Reality Check through the Brexit referendum, 2017 and 2019 general elections, and everything that happened in between, which was quite a lot. We mostly focused on checking the record of government and people in power. So I looked at things like how many police had been cut or added, how much money they were spending on the NHS. Someone would misspeak, shall we say, or massage the numbers to create a particular narrative, whether that's, say, that the government was spending uniquely generously on public services, and we would make sure the context was added and the record was, at least in some way, corrected. At the very least, that can make people in power aware, before they speak, that their facts are being checked.
The biggest ever cash boost to the NHS. How many new hospitals are we going to build? 4, correct. 50,000 new nurses, 50,000 more nurses, I should say, while the BBC are checking 50,000.
It's a nice little acknowledgement from Boris Johnson that the BBC is checking. Thank you. So the idea is people know they're being fact-checked, and they might be incentivized to be more careful with their words. Not totally sure how big a win that one was, but we'll see. So fact-checking can be partly about incentivizing people in power to change their behavior. They know they're being checked, and so they will think about whether they can actually defend the accuracy of what they're saying. You'll notice in that clip the crucial change from more nurses, in other words, there'll actually be 50,000 more nurses working in the NHS, which is probably how most people would understand that promise, to new nurses, meaning we'll hire that many, but at the same time, some of them will leave. So we won't actually end up with 50,000 more nurses in the NHS who can give care, which is quite an important distinction, even though it's just one change of word. It can feel like splitting hairs sometimes if all we achieve is just getting Boris Johnson to change the word more to new, though, and it's difficult to say how big an impact that has. But of course, the audience for fact checks is not just Boris Johnson. or Rishi Sunak, or Keir Starmer, or anyone else with power. We're trying to offer a service to the general population reading this content. And although it sometimes doesn't feel like it, especially for me, when you spend a lot of time in the dark corners of Telegram and Substack among people who are very deeply entrenched in their views, there are big swathes of people in the middle who are open-minded to information and who do just want the best evidence set out for them so they can clarify the situation in their minds. So publishing fact checks like this, although it might seem like a minor distinction, it means that someone who they want to know what the government is actually promising, they might come away better informed about that particular promise, but then they also might be able to apply the same logic in the future. So next time the government makes a promise to add more staff in one way or another, or to spend a particular amount of money, they might think back to that fact check and be able to ask themselves, is this new or additional? Is it new money? Is it net or gross? Those kinds of sort of media literacy or information literacy tools that we want to arm people with, as well as dealing with that specific instance in the moment. Publishing fact checks like this also means that someone who might not be a regular BBC reader, but would go on Google to look for information, that if that's near the top of the search ranks, they might come across our fact check, and at least they can know that it's a topic that's contested, and they might want to then read around it a bit more. That can be really important to keeping people informed, so they're in the best possible position to make their own minds up about big decisions like who to vote for in a general election. It's not really designed to change anyone's mind. It's just designed to kind of set that context out there. But what about when the issue is not who to vote for, but whether an entire political system is legitimate? You might remember the calls around 2020 in the US election, stop the steal, the idea that the entire kind of system was invalid. Or what about whether it's about life-saving public health interventions like vaccines and whether they're safe? So the evidence on fact-checking suggests it can work very well to let people know misinformation is circulating and then fill in that gap with higher quality information when an issue isn't super politically polarized. It's not something that's very deeply about people's identities and that they're very deeply entrenched in. But there are many issues, as you know, where many people are not neutrally seeking information. They're driven by pre-existing beliefs, by their sense of who they are as people and what that means for who and what they align with. So, for example, if you see yourself as someone who speaks truth to power and you see the BBC as an object of power, you might well not want to listen to a BBC journalist telling you the facts. And so what you end up with is people who have lost trust in authorities are looking for people outside of the establishment, whether they see the establishment as being the media, medicine, politics, to tell them the truth as it aligns with how they feel the world is, rather than neutrally looking for information and then making a decision about how they think the world is based off that. So when we're talking about these highly polarized issues, like vaccines, or groups like Trump supporters who believe the 2020 election was illegitimate, simply telling someone that the entire structure of their belief that they've carefully built up over time is wrong, and actually, sorry, the facts say something else, is extremely unlikely to make a difference to them. So that gives us a sense of the limits of this kind of fact-checking. But up until 2020, I would say our focus at the BBC and the focus in general in media and fact-checking was very much on that kind of thing I've just described, where we take a claim and provide the facts to counter or support it. But in the last couple of years, COVID, the election in the US, alongside other major world events, have been a bit of a wake-up call to the limits of this kind of fact-checking. There's a sense, at least, that we are becoming more polarized. If we're becoming more polarized, we're more entrenched in our views. We're not going to listen to these sources of authority telling us what the facts are. Some research recently found there doesn't appear to have been a marked growth in the actual number of people believing in conspiracies. But what there does seem to be evidence of is a greater shift to the extreme in people who might already have had some of those kind of beliefs or tendencies. And I think perhaps because of this, when I talk to people about my job and about disinformation during COVID, very often they go, oh yeah, those guys who think the vaccine's got a microchip in it. They kind of leap to the most extreme and fringe example, but also to the example that is furthest from reality. And I think that can come with this sense that this is all so fringe and detached from reality, we just can't tackle it at all, and so we shouldn't go near it. I've come up against that attitude off the record, even from BBC editors. It's almost sort of the other end of the spectrum from what I was describing before, which is thinking that we can just fact-check everything and that'll sort it. This idea that this is totally wild, totally out there, these people are completely fringe, there's no facts here, we can't address it at all. But actually, what I found through my reporting is even in the most extreme and fringe circles, people are using real evidence, but they're cherry-picking from it to create a false narrative. For example, that the vaccine is just way less safe than we're being told. They're generally not pulling things completely out of nowhere. They are engaging in a really quite sophisticated process of using real data, real scientific papers, video clips, bits of evidence, but patching them together in these misleading ways. So you've probably come to this talk called How to Lie with Data, and we're 10 minutes in, and you're like, she's not taught me how to lie with data at all. I want my money back, which I hear you. This is not going to be a masterclass in that, so please don't go away and say, Rachel taught me how to make up a really great conspiracy theory that's really convincing to everyone. My bosses will not appreciate that. But at this stage, I do want to talk to you a bit about some of these tactics, not just in theory, as I've kind of gone over, but how this actually played out in the wild, as well as what clues these tactics give us to how we can respond. So through my reporting through the pandemic, I've identified 3 main ways that people used real data to create a misleading narrative. And I've seen those exact same tactics cropping up again in other areas, for example, climate denial. So those tactics are underplaying the dangers of the problem, overplaying the dangers of the solution, and then suggesting there's some other amazing solution which is being overlooked or even willfully suppressed. So here we go, number 1. Through the pandemic, a common claim made was that the death toll from COVID was being inflated. You might have come across that. People were claiming that people were dying of other things while coincidentally having the virus, or they were people who were just going to die anyway. The implication was that the virus was not as serious as was being claimed, and therefore the things being done to manage it were an overreaction, or possibly even, in the most extreme, a plot to control the population. I should say, a lot of this came from people who were anti-lockdown, and there is plenty of valid discussion to be had about that policy, whether it's too draconian, whether it was managed correctly. I'm absolutely not saying that no questions should be asked and beat people over the head with facts. It's just that we should ask those questions from a basis of the best information possible and be really clear what we are actually talking about. So we can say it definitely does not seem to be true that everyone dying of COVID was going to die anyway. I put that in quote marks because obviously everyone's going to die anyway at some point. And we know that partly because we can see how many more people died of anything during the pandemic, during that period, than the 5-year average. So many more people than we would expect died during that period, and that number tracked very closely with the number of people who were recorded as having died of COVID. So it certainly seems like there was something going on there. But the thing that's so powerful here with this kind of argument is that people were picking up on real bits of data. And so then when you say, no, that's not the evidence say, it's very easy for people to say, well, it's government data. This is a real thing. So the government did publish a measure of deaths within 28 days of a positive COVID test, which did include people who had died of other things. This got picked up online by some influencers who perhaps already had a desire to underplay COVID, maybe, as we say, because they really didn't agree with lockdown restrictions, which is a fair view and a fair opinion, but again, let's come from a basis of facts here. So some of these people used this data to say all these deaths, all these COVID deaths, were really people who'd come in with a heart attack, they'd been hit by a car, and they just happened to test positive for COVID. So this is a real figure. It's not totally made up out of nowhere. Of course, there are also people who died of COVID without ever having a positive test, especially at the start of the pandemic, but the people creating this narrative conveniently forget that bit of the equation. So this conclusion can sound incredibly convincing, except this is not the only way of understanding the death toll. We have another measure of people whose deaths a doctor has judged based on tests and examinations was directly caused by COVID, and so that doctor, with all of their qualification and experience, has written it on that person's death certificate. It's unlikely, or we'd need a very high bar of evidence to prove that on a systematic level we had loads of doctors getting a car crash victim in and saying, oh yeah, that looks like COVID. That would be quite a serious thing, and if that were happening, as I say, it would require an investigation, it would require evidence. So that figure of death certificates is actually higher than the 28-day measure. So if you look at just the people who died within a month of having a positive test, including some people who may not have died of COVID, it doesn't inflate the COVID deaths. It actually underestimates them. So then the narrative moves on, as it tends to do. It's whack-a-mole. You hit one thing down and people find another way to go, and that's a real challenge here. So people then moved on to looking at death certificates because people were saying, this is the real way to understand them. And they found a way to cast doubt on that data too. So a bunch of people dug into official death data, and they found a table showing there were, at this point in time, 17,000 people in England and Wales who had died of COVID who had nothing else written on their death certificate. They had no other conditions listed there. And they used that to say, this showed the true COVID death toll. Only people who only had COVID written on their death certificates could be real COVID deaths, and everyone else must not count. So you can see from some of these comments, hopefully, how it was being interpreted. The pandemic is a fraud, it's a pack of lies, mainstream media is ignoring the truth, it's just a narrative, it's now collapsing. All of this over a ONS data table. I don't think that the ONS ever imagined that they would gain such prominence. Probably quite exciting. So that was what people were making the accusation of. Except that's not what those numbers can show, and I'm going to try and explain why. When a doctor fills in a death certificate, they base it on looking at someone's medical records, their test results, their physical symptoms. Basically, it's the best possible way we have of understanding what someone may have died of. It's not perfect, but it's the best tool we have. It's regularly used, it's used for other conditions, it's used across the world. And people basically never die of one clear-cut thing. So you might have COVID, which causes pneumonia, which causes respiratory failure, and that's what kills you. I'm sorry, this is rattling off a very bleak list, so I apologise for that. If you get hit by a car and suffer internal bleeding, you won't just have car accident on your death certificate, even though I think most people would reasonably agree that that's what killed you. You'll have a chain of events recorded, the original accident, the injury it caused, how the progress of that injury led to your death, so say blunt force trauma, bleeding, traumatic brain injury, multiple organ failure, could be a chain of events. So now if you imagine that that person in a car crash also had a pre-existing condition that maybe affected their blood clotting and made it harder to stem the bleeding, would you then say, well, I don't really think that person died in a car accident then? I don't think most people would make that argument, but that was a useful comparison to make to people who were trying to do the same thing with COVID deaths. If you wouldn't do that in the case of a car accident, when that's the exact same data, it's the exact same thought process, why wouldn't you do it in that case? And why do you do it in the case of COVID? It's not to say to people, you're wrong, it's to make people think and maybe they feel, well, I can do that for COVID. In that case, I'd like to know why. So the tactic that people were using to say this data showed only 17,000 people really died of COVID excludes all the people who had other issues that were actually caused by the COVID itself that contributed to their death. And it also includes the many, many people living with another health condition, as so many people are, that might have no bearing at all on their life expectancy had they not caught COVID in that moment. So this kind of misinformation, what's the impact of it? It can really increase people's mistrust in authorities, first of all, and there's evidence to show that this kind of misinformation decreases people's willingness to keep to public health measures, including possibly things like having a vaccine. But it's really hurtful to the people whose loved ones are having their deaths basically discounted. Oh yeah, I forgot to change the slide. That's the death certificate, I'm sure. Very exciting for you to look at. That's where you write the other conditions. On we go. So as well as providing the correct information and explaining why the data didn't say what people were claiming, I was able to report on this piece of misinformation through the story of Matt, who lost his dad Ian to COVID. He was 56, he had type 2 diabetes that he was managing very well through his diet, and it had very little impact otherwise on his life. And Matt was understandably deeply distressed by the idea that his dad's death from COVID didn't count just because he had diabetes. I think here, putting it in terms of a human story, it not only helps to expose the harm and distress caused by misinformation, and of course it's the thing that chimes most with people, a human story. It's the most powerful thing for people to connect with. But it actually also helps to illustrate why it was incorrect. It's much harder to hear the true details of Ian's life and death, I think, and then say he didn't count, than it is to do the same looking at a table of context-free numbers. So, after downplaying the virus, the next very common tactic that I saw is overplaying the dangers of the things used to tackle COVID, especially vaccines. A lot of this happened around lockdown and masks, of course, as well, but I'm going to focus a bit on vaccines for now. So in this example, rather than undercounting, it involves a case of people using real data, but to overcount something to create a false narrative. So after the COVID vaccine began to be rolled out, lots of people started making claims that a large number of people were being seriously injured or dying from it. It was wrong, but it was hard to debunk without understanding where people were getting this from, without just saying, no, that's not based on evidence, that's not right, which is not particularly persuasive for anyone, really. But once you understand that people are taking these numbers from records of people that happened to people after receiving a vaccine. So it's records of things that happened after the vaccine, but it's not records of things that were necessarily caused by the vaccine. Then it's easier for us to understand what kind of tools we can use to explain this to people and why these figures don't say what they're claiming. So first off, hundreds of millions of people worldwide were vaccinated within a few months. All the health conditions you'd usually expect to see, all the serious things like heart attacks and strokes that are actually unfortunately quite common in the population, all of those were still happening. And because so many people were being vaccinated so quickly, inevitably some of them will have happened immediately after someone got the jab. People monitoring the safety of the jab will look at that data, but not just on its own, they analyse it, they look to see if there are more cases of a condition than you'd normally expect to see in the population, and even then that's a starting point, and more studies will be required to confirm the link. That's the kind of information that I think might chime with someone who is not really suspicious of vaccines, might have seen that data, wants to know where it comes from, but fundamentally they're not very entrenched. I don't think those arguments are very convincing to people who deeply believe and are deeply anti-vax. Especially, if someone generally doesn't trust what they're being told by the media and by governments, and they can see those worrying incidents in black and white with their own eyes. It's a database they can look at, they can see numbers, they can do the work themselves to look at it. So, how do we approach that in that case if we can't just tell people, don't worry, that's not what the evidence says? So if you look at all the things reported in these various safety databases, and you say they're all definitely side effects of the COVID vaccine or another vaccine, you absolutely can get to some really high and worrying sounding numbers of things like heart attacks and strokes, and that's what people are drawing on. You also get some other more unexpected vaccine side effects. So in the same database, you find gunshot wounds, herpes, psychiatric disorders, car crashes, relationship breakdowns. You also get some things that probably never happened at all. Can't be sure. I don't want to stand before you here today and say that someone definitely didn't turn into the Hulk, but it feels unlikely. So rather than just saying, actually, here's what the data really says, I'll often put this to people and say, well, you're really sure that all of the strokes in this database must have been caused by the vaccine. You can see it with your own eyes, it's there in black and white, I understand that. But then look at these other things here in black and white. Do you think they've been caused by the vaccine? And if not, why not? Why do you think one is and not the other? So rather than just saying, look, I know better than you what this data can and can't be used for, and you need to listen to me, you can get people to look at those incidents themselves and do the process themselves. So just as they've done this process of building a belief with evidence by looking at the data, you can encourage people to do that, to check that belief and do that same process for themselves, just to ask themselves whether that makes sense or not to them. So I should stress at this point, there have been some rare, serious side effects for the vaccines, and they have been uncovered through our monitoring processes, which do include these databases, although never from them alone. And they're just not happening in the numbers that many online are suggesting, which obviously very much changes the risk-benefit. If you think that many, many thousands of people are being harmed and not many people are being helped by the vaccine, you're going to have a very different view of whether this is a good risk-benefit calculation. But actually, this misuse of figures also harms people with genuine vaccine injuries. I've reported on some of those cases of people who do have genuine kind of proven accepted vaccine injuries who are trying to claim compensation. And they all, without fail, told me they found being associated with and exploited by anti-vaccine campaigns using data in this way was really upsetting, and they felt that it really hurt their efforts to get help. So if these people are coming and saying, I'm here to campaign for the rights of vaccine-injured people, well, that's not what I'm hearing from vaccine-injured people. Something to think about. So this kind of work is quite relentless, and it often has to happen on quite an individual level. So I still get someone coming to me with a misapprehension about vaccines that I can tell comes from looking at this particular type of data from one of these databases. Even if they don't actually realise that's where it's coming from, they might have seen it on a Telegram post, but that's usually, I can figure out that's where it's coming from. I would say I get someone coming to me with that at least once a week, still now. So we can try and squash it, but I'm not going to pretend like, great, we've done fact checks and now it's all over. It's an ongoing process, and some of these myths are really, really hard to kill. So the final tactic I want to talk to you about is this idea that there's an alternative sort of miraculous solution that's not being tried. You see this with climate change as well, that people will say, we don't need to do X, Y, and Z, that sounds really difficult. We can just do this and it's really easy, but they're not trying it. Or, this is a really cheap solution that they're not trying because they have profit motives or whatever it is. And that comes from people who aren't sort of COVID deniers. They'll say, yes, there is a problem. We just don't have to do the thing you're suggesting. And when it comes to COVID, this really took off with an anti-parasitic drug called ivermectin, which you might have heard of. So ivermectin actually started being used at the beginning of the pandemic in countries that use the drug commonly anyway for parasites. And it's something that people in a lot of countries are just really familiar with buying in pharmacies and having in their cupboards. So especially in India, Brazil, Peru, other Latin American, Caribbean countries. So there was some belief that it might help with COVID, but crucially, it was being used at a time when there was no vaccine. So governments were desperate to be seen to be doing something and trying something and have something to offer their people that might help. But there was a real shift in 2021 when the idea of this drug as an amazing COVID cure that could completely solve the problem, got picked up by the US and then Australian and UK groups, and they picked it up after there was a vaccine available. So at the same time as promoting ivermectin and saying, look how great it is, they were also using the safety data I just mentioned to suggest the vaccine wasn't safe. So therefore, this is a safer, cheaper, better alternative. And as I say, a very big part of this is the idea, which I should say doesn't have absolutely no basis in reality, that pharmaceutical companies are just in it for profit. But they start with that, grain of truth, and they leap from that to suggesting governments had been leaned on to only focus on the vaccine. They were ignoring cheap generic drugs like ivermectin, which, according to them, could prevent virtually all cases of COVID infections and disease. What was so tricky about this case, and why it took some quite deep investigation rather than just a quick debunking, was that the lobbying here was largely fronted by doctors. Although they were relatively small in number and they didn't represent the scientific consensus, they were doctors, and some of them had previously been quite respected, and they were pointing to real studies. So they weren't just pulling it out of thin air, but they weren't assessing the quality of studies at all, and they were ignoring any information that didn't fit in and that contradicted their belief. So if you're unfamiliar with scientific studies, when you read one, you might feel like, this is absolute proof of something. If you've got a scientific paper in your hand or on your screen and, it all looks very official, and you think, this is science, man. This has been tested. This is proof. This is something I can believe in. So you might look at a study's conclusion and see it says that the drug reduced hospitalizations by 90%, say, and you think, that sounds amazing. This drug is clearly really effective. Get rid of 90% of COVID. That's great. Why aren't we using it? Let's give this to everyone, right? You have to understand, and it's the boring bit, but we do have to understand it, how high quality is this study? Were they looking at a drug killing the virus in a petri dish, but not at what happens when you translate it into an actual human body, for example, as the cartoon in this slide suggests? So we have to ask, did they give the drug or a placebo randomly, or did they just look at people in the population who were taking it anyway, who might be different in some ways? We see that a lot in vitamins, where if you just look at observational studies of the use of vitamins, it can look like certain vitamins have huge benefits for things like cancer, which disappear when you correct for the fact that who are the types of people who take vitamins? They have access to other things that might make them healthier anyway. So when it came to ivermectin, we saw people just taking the headline of any study at all that found a benefit for ivermectin, regardless of whether it was really low quality, not asking the right question, and then saying, well, hundreds of studies can't be wrong. Why are you ignoring all this data, all these real scientific papers? By working with a team of independent scientists and getting hold of the raw data from these studies, we were able to not only question the quality of the studies, which you can kind of see from the surface, but actually uncover such serious errors and signs of potential fraud in some of these studies that the whole evidence base basically just collapsed. After our investigation, the whole thing did kind of die down. It had reached a bit of a fever pitch, so it's always hard to say whether these things are natural cycles. And there were some rumblings, that continued afterwards. But I think that, after that, ivermectin did cease to be the main talking point for people suspicious of vaccines. But these misinformation narratives gain their power precisely because they use real data and evidence. And that allows people to feel that they are drawing on a source of authority, they're doing their own research, they're finding something that other people have missed. And I think it almost works like a mirror image of the scientific process. So you start with your belief, and then you search out, you manipulate whatever evidence that you can to bolster that belief, rather than starting with the evidence and then drawing the belief from there. But because it is using something real, which people can sort of independently verify or feel like they're verifying, and they can see it with their own eyes, you can find yourself through this living in a really convincing world of alternative facts. And then if you're seeing all this really convincing evidence and no one is reporting it, it adds to the sense that there is some conspiracy to suppress it, which can cause people to go even deeper into their beliefs. I see that time and time again with kind of nothing studies that come up, and people will go, why is the BBC not reporting this? Why is mainstream media not reporting this? It's being ignored. It's a huge challenge for fact checkers and for those of us who report on disinformation, because it's not like people have just stumbled into an incorrect set of facts and they just need to be given the correct facts and then great, they're on their way, everything's fine. These beliefs are deeply emotional and they're rooted in people's identities, but they're also hard-won. So if you've gone through this process of gathering evidence and information and constructing a belief from these bits of real things, you've done all that mental work, you've kind of invested something in it, it then becomes much harder to let go of that belief. And I would invite you to think about, a belief that you hold very dear and is very important to you, and how it makes you feel emotionally if someone challenges you. Maybe they challenge you with, a study or a piece of evidence to the contrary. It's quite, confronting. We don't like that feeling once we've invested in a belief. But I think what's important to remember here is that people do still care about the idea of facts, and they want things to be logically coherent, at least inside their own brains. I think that's a thing that's missed a lot when we talk about conspiracies, and people do tend to assume that it is just this wild fantasy land that's based on nothing. People still are seeking truth, they're seeking facts. So I think this use of real data, as I say, poses a huge challenge, but it also gives us a tool to tackle it. Just as someone has done that process to build up a belief, they can go through a process to dismantle it and construct a new one. It's just hard. It's not easy. So we might have a better chance by approaching it, not just saying, this is wrong, and here's what's right, but by trying to unpick the underlying logic of what people are saying. So if you can explain how data is being manipulated, or where there are plain logical inconsistencies, it's unlikely to sort of immediately change anyone's mind. I'm not saying it is. Like, you go, guys, this doesn't make logical sense, and they'll be like, yeah, right, you are. I'm with you now. You know, it's not like that. But it might just open a crack where they might think again, and maybe, in the best case scenario, start their own process of reevaluating the evidence. And that's why saying, look, I can show you there are gunshot wounds in the vaccine safety data. Can you explain that to me? Like, can you see that? How does that fit in? Might be more effective than just saying, that's false and this is what's true and this is what the data says. I also always try and remember, and I've touched on this already, that if someone doesn't trust the information coming from traditional forms of authority, which might be for all manner of very valid reasons and life experiences, they're quite unlikely to listen to someone like me, a BBC journalist, just giving them a different set of facts. And we know that people who do make their way out of the rabbit hole will most often do so with the help of people who love them and know them and are people in their lives. So the way I look at it, and what I see as another kind of important role of this kind of work, is arming the population in general with these tools and bits of information, because you might not be able to reach someone directly, but you could possibly indirectly help someone else reach them, if that's someone in their lives, someone they love and who loves and trusts them. And finally, if we're going to improve media literacy, I can't go away without talking about the role of influencers. These three examples I've talked to you about have been huge themes in misinformation, which have cropped up all over the world. They've been massive, they've been incredibly viral, and they've come from all sorts of people. But it's not that all of those people have spontaneously done the same logical process to arrive at these same conclusions necessarily. They get spread, they get amplified, this way of thinking gets spread because of an often relatively small number of influencers. So just looking at where a claim has come from and who is spreading it can be enlightening. So one of the problematic things about how information spreads online in general is that it kind of gets robbed of its context. We see that a lot. So, you might see something on your feed being shared by a friend or a celebrity, and you have no idea where that first originated. So you might not know that that comes from someone with a track record of spreading things that have been proven false or a very specific ideological view. Let's say, a link to the far right or whatever, which an individual might not find very palatable, but they've seen it in the words of their friend or someone they know, and so they don't see that link. And so a lot of people who get sucked into these movements, they might have chimed with them because they feel very negatively about government, say, but actually not everyone in those movements approves of some of the other things that come along with that, racist, anti-Semitic sentiments, and that bit doesn't actually integrate so nicely into their identity. Of course, that's not the case for everyone, but there are lots of people in these movements which are endorsing that kind of language, but they themselves don't endorse it. And so I think putting things back into that context, whether someone's been making money off the site, off spreading this information, they're selling products, whether they've said lots of things that have been proven wrong that would be more likely to chime with that person as being wrong, I think those things can be a very helpful way of letting people evaluate information more accurately for themselves, as well as just debunking it. That's why it's always important to me, as well as providing the facts, to trace where a misinformation narrative has come from, when did it go viral, what were the accounts that made it go viral, and kind of what's their deal. Because putting it back in that context, I think, just can be really helpful for people to understand where it's come from. And something I've actually seen change pretty entrenched people's minds more than just presenting them with alternative facts, is when they realise, okay, I don't feel like the mainstream media or government or whoever have my best interests at heart, like fair enough. But actually, hang on, this person on the internet telling me things clearly doesn't have my best interests at heart either. They're making a lot of money, they have a political aim, what's their deal? And it can help people think about where that is coming from. So, fact check, yes. Warning people that misinformation is circulating, as well as giving them the facts, can make for a better informed and more media literate population. But also, we can explain how the information got to their feed, who's spreading it and what they might be gaining. We can expose logical inconsistencies and give people the tools to see that for themselves. We can show the effects of misinformation and tell the stories of the people harmed. No one strategy is going to be right for everyone. So it's a case of hitting all these different elements and of doing it repeatedly that gives us the best shots of combating misinformation. But I wanted to give the final word on that to Brent Lee, someone who has actually experienced going deep into the conspiracy rabbit hole and managed to come out the other side. This is from his YouTube channel, which you can find. He's called Brent Lee TV. He's got lots of interesting videos there. So with his permission, I would just like to share this thought.
We're talking between 2015 and 2018 now. From the moment of me distancing myself from these online communities till I was completely done with it. During those years, my interests in politics, religion, society, culture, they all continued to blossom. And honestly, the more I learned, the more I found the things I knew were wrong. The logistics of this grand conspiracy were just impossible. And I just couldn't make anything fit anymore. Then on the world stage, there was quite a lot of things happening that really didn't fit with my understanding of the New World Order agenda. A few things that were really the final nails in the coffin was QAnon and the election of Trump. And over here in England, it was the United Kingdom voting for Brexit and the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn taking over the Labour Party. Now, to me, the Illuminati would have never allowed these things to happen. They just were not a part of the agenda. So those were pretty much the final nails in the coffin. So, final question was...
It goes on, but we can probably skip to that. But essentially what he kind of goes on to say and finishes, once he realised that things were logically incoherent, that kind of didn't fit together. I love that point about logistics. I always think of this, like, this grand conspiracy. What are the logistics? Where are they meeting? Anyway, so once he realised that those things didn't fit together, what he said happened next was he logged off. He logged off Facebook. He stepped away from that community. He stepped away from all of the people who were telling him these things, sharing new information with him. He just logged off and continued to, grow the things that he was interested in life, read about politics, read about history, read about society, but stepped away from those amplified messages. And by the end of it, and by the end of what he describes as his own deprogramming, he felt like he'd gathered enough evidence to make the argument coherently to himself that the idea of a grand conspiracy was itself a hoax. It was about evidence, it was about facts and logic that both got him in and got him out of that rabbit hole.